The rain in this part of England didn't just fall. It felt like it was trying to erase the world. It was a relentless, gray deluge that turned the rolling hills into a blur of slate and charcoal. Inside the carriage, the air was thick with the smell of damp wool and anxiety. The wheels groaned and skidded, fighting a losing battle against the deepening mud of the country lane. Isabella Rossi sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, smoothing the silk of her traveling gown. For perhaps the 20th time, she was 32 years old. A woman who had known the golden heat of Rome and the sharp sting of public humiliation. She wasn't a naive debutante. She was a woman who had packed her entire life into a trunk because she needed to disappear. And because a brochure had promised that Ravenscroft Manor was a place of quiet tradition. She looked out the window at the massive stone structure rising above the trees. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress built to keep happiness out. She took a deep breath. She reminded herself that she was the daughter of a resilient line, that she had survived the whispers of Italian society, and that she could certainly survive an English country estate. But as the carriage lurched to a final, mud-splattered halt, Isabella realized that quiet tradition was a lie. She stepped out, expecting a footman, a bow, perhaps a dry umbrella. Instead, she stepped into absolute pandemonium. The front door of the manor was wide open, swinging, banging against the frame in the wind. A trunk not hers was sitting abandoned on the bottom step, its lid flapping open like a broken wing. A maid ran past, shrieking, chasing something that looked suspiciously like a piglet through the rain-soaked hydrangeas. And there, standing in the center of the storm, was a man who looked as though he was witnessing the apocalypse. It was Mr. Higgins, the butler. He was pale, sweating despite the chill, and clutching his chest. He spotted Isabella, and looked less like he was greeting a guest, and more like he was seeing a ghost. "My lady," he gasped, bowing so low and fast, he nearly tipped over. We didn't expect you for another hour, clearly," Isabella said, her voice calm against the howling wind. She looked at the abandoned trunk on the stairs. "Is someone arriving or fleeing?" "Mr. Higgins." Higgins pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his forehead. "That would be Miss Miller's trunk." "Madam, the prospective bride before you. She left 10 minutes ago." Isabella blinked. "She left. She just arrived. She said the spirits of chaos were too much for her nerves," Higgins whispered, looking over his shoulder as if the house itself were listening. "Chaos," Isabella repeated. She looked up at the stone facade of Ravenscroft. It loomed over her, dark and impenetrable. "Well, Mr. Higgins, I have traveled 3 days to get here. I am Italian. We are quite comfortable with chaos. Shall we go inside?" She swept past him, into the great hall. If the outside was a storm, the inside was a tomb. It was magnificent. Certainly high-vaulted ceilings, tapestries that probably cost more than a small village, and stone floors that echoed with history. But the air was freezing. It smelled of lemon wax, old dust, and a profound, heavy silence. "Is Lord Thorne at home?" Isabella asked. Pulling off her gloves, Higgins winced. It was a full-body flinch. "Ah, that is a complication. A complication. He is away. Madam, emergency business in London. We expect him back within the week." Isabella turned slowly. "A week? You expect me to stay here, unchaperoned, in a house where the previous guest fled in terror? For a week?" "The Dowager is arriving tomorrow," Higgins said quickly, looking like he might cry. "And the children, well, someone must watch the children." The children. Just then, a loud crash echoed from the top of the grand staircase. It sounded like expensive porcelain meeting a tragic end. Isabella looked up. High above, peering over the banister of the second-floor gallery. Were 3 heads. The oldest was a boy. Perhaps 12. He had dark hair and eyes that were already narrowed in suspicion. This was Julian. He didn't look like a child. He looked like a miniature. Angry landlord. Beside him was a girl. Maybe 8. With hair that looked like it had been styled by a tornado, and a grin missing a front tooth. That was Clara. And peering through the rails at the very bottom was a small boy of 5. Leo. They stared at her. She stared at them. It was a standoff. "Are you the new one?" Clara shouted down. Her voice echoing off the stone. Isabella took a step forward. "I am Isabella. Father said number 9 was coming today." Clara yelled, "Number 9." Isabella felt a cold prickle on the back of her neck. She wasn't a guest. She wasn't a romantic prospect. She was an interview. The 9th interview. Clara. Julian hissed, pulling his sister back. "You aren't supposed to tell her that. Besides, she won't stay. Look at her dress. She's too fancy. She'll run just like the last one." Isabella felt a sudden flare of heat in her chest. It wasn't anger. Exactly. It was pride. She had survived a broken heart in Rome. She would not be defeated by a 12-year-old boy in a drafty English hall. She looked up at Julian. "I assume I have a room," she asked, keeping her voice steady, the blue suite. Higgins stammered, "Wait." A small voice drifted down. It was Leo. The youngest. He had pushed his face through the railings. "Is that a dog?" Isabella looked down at the basket she had carried in with her. A small, scruffy head poked out Barnaby. The stray she had refused to leave behind. "Yes," Isabella said, her voice softening instinctively. "His name is Barnaby. He's small." Julian scoffed from the top of the stairs. "Father says small dogs are useless." Isabella looked straight at the boy. He had his father's jawline, she suspected. And definitely his father's arrogance. "Your father is not here." "Julian," Isabella called up, her voice clear. "And Barnaby is not useless. He is an excellent judge of character." She turned to the trembling butler. "Mr. Higgins, I will take dinner in the dining room at 6 o'clock, and the children will join me." "We don't eat in the dining room," Julian shouted down. Defiant. "Father forbids it." Isabella started up the stairs, her silk skirts rustling like armor. She didn't look back. "Your father," she said, "is away." The dining room that evening was a study in desolation. The mahogany table stretched out like a dark lake, long enough to seat 30 people, but set for only 4. The silence was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock that sounded like a countdown. Isabella sat at one end. Julian sat at the far end, in the master's chair. He looked ridiculous, a small boy swallowed by a massive velvet throne, but his expression was dead serious. Clara and Leo sat on the sides, their legs swinging nervously, their eyes darting between Isabella and their brother. Servants moved like shadows, placing bowls of soup in front of them. The only sound was the clinking of silver against china. "This soup is cold," Julian announced. He dropped his spoon. Clang. Higgins, standing by the sideboard, stiffened. "My lord." It came directly from the kitchen. "It is cold," Julian insisted, locking eyes with Isabella. It was a challenge, a test. Isabella didn't look up from her bowl. She took a sip. It was lukewarm at best. But she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "It is perfectly adequate." "Julian, perhaps you are just shivering from the draft in this empty barn of a house." Clara giggled. Julian shot her a glare that could have withered a flower. "We aren't allowed to speak at dinner," Julian said icily. "Father says silence aids digestion." Isabella set her spoon down. She looked at the 3 of them. They were dressed in fine clothes, sitting in a castle, and they looked utterly miserable. "Your father," Isabella said calmly, "seems to have a great many rules, for a man who is never here to enforce them. He will be back." Julian snapped. "And he won't like this. You acting like you belong here. You're just a guest. Guests leave. Prospective brides leave faster. You are trying to frighten me." "Julian," Isabella observed, "I am stating facts. You are trying to be rude, so that I will leave like Miss Miller." "And the 8 women before me." Julian didn't answer. He just gripped the arms of his father's chair until his knuckles turned white. "It is a clever strategy," Isabella admitted. "If I were a governess, I would be terrified. But I am not a governess. And I have endured far worse dining companions than you. I once had dinner with a duke in Rome, who checked his reflection in his soup spoon every 30 seconds. Clara's eyes went wide. Why? Because he loved himself more than he loved the conversation, Isabella said. She looked at Leo. The little boy hadn't touched his food. He was holding something under the table. "Leo," Isabella said softly. "What do you have there?" Leo froze. He looked at Julian for permission. Julian gave a barely perceptible nod, slowly. Leo lifted his hand. He was holding a small, wooden horse. It was beautifully carved. But one of the legs was snapped off, leaving a jagged splinter. "It's broken," Leo whispered. It was the first time he had spoken. "Father says broken things should be thrown away," Julian said, his voice flat. "He says they are clutter." Isabella looked at the toy, and then at the boy clutching it like a lifeline. And suddenly, she understood. The coldness of the house wasn't just the weather. The ghost haunting Ravenscroft wasn't a spirit in chains. It was grief. It was a father who couldn't look at his children because they reminded him of a wife he had lost. It was a man who demanded silence because noise hurt him. It was a house where broken things were thrown away. And these children motherless, lonely, and spirited felt like they were the broken things. Isabella felt the armor around her heart crack. She wasn't just here to find a husband. She was here to stop a tragedy in slow motion. "Your father is wrong," Isabella said, firmly. The children stared at her. Nobody said their father was wrong. She reached into her small purse, hanging on the chair, and pulled out a clean linen handkerchief. "May I see it?" Leo hesitated, then handed her the horse. Isabella wrapped the handkerchief around the horse's jagged leg, tying it like a bandage. "There," she said, handing it back. "It isn't broken anymore. It is just wounded. And wounds heal. Leo, if you give them time." Leo took the horse back. He touched the soft linen bandage. A tiny, tentative smile touched his lips. Isabella picked up her spoon. She looked down the long, dark table at Julian, who was watching her with a mixture of confusion and suspicion. "Now," Isabella said, her voice ringing clear in the silence. "This soup is indeed terrible. Who knows the way to the kitchen?" The rain didn't stop. For 3 days. It hammered against the roof of Ravenscroft Manor like a drumroll that never reached a crescendo. The house, already a fortress of solitude, had become a prison. In the nursery, the air was stale, smelling of old chalk and boredom. Julian was staring out the window, tracing the path of raindrops with a finger, looking like a prisoner counting the days of a sentence. Clara was lying on the rug, sighing loudly every 30 seconds. A metronome of misery. And Leo was in the corner, clutching his bandaged wooden horse, making himself as small as possible. Isabella Rossi had reached her limit. She was Italian. She was built for sun, for piazza noise, for life lived out loud. This silence was not peaceful. It was suffocating. She looked at the children, their spirits graying like the sky outside, and she felt a snap of rebellion in her chest. "Enough," she announced, standing up. The rustle of her dress was the loudest sound in the room. Julian didn't turn around. "We are studying." "Isabella, you are staring at rain." "Julian, and if Clara sighs one more time, she will deflate entirely." Isabella walked to the door, and threw it open. Up. All of you. We are going downstairs. Downstairs, Julian looked horrified. To the library. Lower. Isabella said, a mischievous glint in her dark eyes. To the forbidden zone. The kitchen at Ravenscroft was a cavernous stone world that the children had never seen. It was strictly servants' territory, a place Lord Thorne had deemed unnecessary for young minds. When the procession entered a noblewoman, 3 stunned children, and a scruffy dog named Barnaby Mrs. Pringle, the cook, nearly dropped a pot of boiling potatoes. My stars, Mrs. Pringle gasped, wiping her hands on her apron. Miss Isabella, is the house on fire? The house is freezing. Mrs. Pringle, Isabella declared, setting Leo down on a sturdy wooden bench near the massive hearth. And we require heat. Not just from the fire, but from the soul. Do you have olive oil, Rosemary? And yeast. Yeast. Mrs. Pringle blinked. To bake. In Rome, Isabella said, rolling up the sleeves of her silk gown. When the sky cries, we bake. Wash your hands. Everyone. Today. The rules of Ravenscroft are suspended. 10 minutes later, the sanctuary of silence had been utterly desecrated. The smell of dust and beeswax, which had choked the hallways for years, was being violently evicted by the scent of blooming yeast, crushed rosemary, and rich olive oil. It was a savory, golden smell, the smell of life. Isabella was no longer a prospective bride. She was a general in a war against gloom. She stood at the large oak work table, her face dusted with flour, guiding small hands. Push it, she instructed Clara, who was attacking a mound of dough with enthusiastic violence. The dough is alive. Clara, it needs to know you are the boss, but that you love it. It feels like a squishy pillow, Clara shrieked. Laughing, even Julian had abandoned his dignity. He stood by the oven, watching the focaccia rise. His face flushed from the heat of the fire. He looked younger. He looked like a boy. You are making a mess, Julian pointed out, eyeing a smudge of flour on Isabella's nose. I am making memories. Julian, Isabella corrected, tossing a sprig of rosemary at him. There is a difference. Then, it happened. Barnaby, the scruffy terrier, who had been patrolling the floor for scraps, saw his opportunity. A ball of dough rolled off the edge of the table. Barnaby leaped, caught it mid-air, and landed in a skid. Looking immensely proud of his theft, he shook the dough like a captured rat, white powder exploding off his snout. From the corner of the room, a sound erupted. It wasn't a cough, and it wasn't a sneeze. It was a rusty, high-pitched, hiccuping giggle. The room froze. Everyone turned to look at Leo. The little boy was pointing at the dog, his shoulders shaking, his mouth wide open in a joyous, unrestrained laugh. It was the first time Isabella had heard his voice rise above a whisper. It was the first time Julian had seen his brother smile in a year. Isabella felt a lump in her throat. She looked at the flour covering the floor, the chaotic kitchen, the laughing child. This, she thought, this is what a family looks like. But the warmth of the kitchen couldn't reach the front door. Upstairs, the heavy oak doors of the main entrance groaned open. A blast of cold wind swept into the great hall, extinguishing 2 candles. Lord Alistair Thorne stood in the doorway. He was a week early. He was soaked to the bone, his riding coat heavy with rain, his face set in a grim line of exhaustion and control. He had ridden hard from London to escape his own thoughts, only to find his sanctuary compromised. He didn't hear silence. He heard noise, thumping, laughter. It was coming from the floorboards. He walked into the great hall. He stopped. There, on his pristine Persian runner, was a trail of white footprints. Small ones, large ones, Paw prints. Higgins Alistair's voice was a crack of thunder that rivaled the storm outside. The laughter downstairs died instantly. By the time the kitchen procession made it to the top of the stairs, the atmosphere had shifted from a carnival to a court-martial. Isabella led the way, holding a tray of steaming golden focaccia. Behind her, the children and the dog trailed, covered in evidence. Alistair stood in the center of the hall. He looked at the flower on his son's jacket. He looked at the rosemary in his daughter's hair. He looked at Isabella, who had a smudge of white across her cheek and defiance in her eyes. Lord Thorne, Isabella said, dipping into a curtsy that was made slightly ridiculous by the baking tray. Welcome home. Alistair didn't bow back. His gray eyes were cold. Scanning the mess. Isabella, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Explain this. We were hungry. Isabella said simply. Hungry. Alistair stepped forward, looming over them. Dinner is served at 6. Rules exist for a reason. Isabella. Structure is what keeps chaos at bay. Chaos. Isabella stepped forward too, invading his personal space. She smelled of rain and yeast, a dizzying combination. You call this chaos. I call it breathing. Alistair looked at Julian. The boy flinched, instinctively stepping behind Isabella. That movement, that instinctive seek for protection from her, cut Alistair deeper than any knife. You have broken the schedule, Alistair said, his voice tight. You have taken them to the servants' quarters. You have encouraged wildness. I encouraged joy. Isabella countered. It had been absent so long, I feared it had forgotten the address. You have turned my house into a bakery. Alistair snapped, gesturing to the tray. The hall went silent. The servants watched from the shadows. The children held their breath. Isabella looked him dead in the eye. She didn't back down. She didn't apologize. I have turned your house into a home, she said, her voice steady and ringing off the stones. There is a difference, my lord. One is for surviving. The other is for living. You have been surviving here, Alistair. Surviving grief. Surviving silence. But look at them. She gestured to the children. They need to live. Alistair stared at her. He was prepared for tears. He was prepared for excuses. He was not prepared for a woman who looked at his anger and saw only his fear. He looked down at the tray in her hands. The bread was golden, glistening with oil and salt. It smelled incredible. It smelled like a memory he couldn't quite place. Something from before the winter took hold of his heart. Who made this? Alistair asked quietly. Julian made the one on the left, Isabella said. He has an excellent eye for structure. Like his father. Alistair froze. He looked at his eldest son. Julian was trembling slightly, but he lifted his chin. I needed the dough. Father, Julian whispered. Alistair reached out. His gloved hand hovered over the bread. He tore off a piece. The crust crackled a sound that seemed deafening in the quiet hall. He put the piece in his mouth. It was warm. It was salty. It was imperfect, rustic, and utterly real. It tasted nothing like the cold French culinary perfection he usually demanded. It tasted like warmth. Alistair chewed slowly. He swallowed. He looked at Julian. He expected to see the boy shrinking away. Instead, Julian was watching him, eyes wide, waiting. And for the first time in years, the boy didn't look scared. He looked proud. Something tight in Alistair's chest loosened. Just a fraction. It is adequate, Alistair said gruffly. It is delicious, Clara yelled, unable to help herself. And we like her. You can't send her away. Alistair looked at Clara, shocked by the outburst. Then he looked back at Isabella. She was watching him. A challenge in the arch of her brow, but a softness in her eyes that unnerved him. Go wash your faces, Alistair commanded the children. You look like Miller's. Dinner is at 7. He turned on his heel to leave. But he paused. He didn't look back. But he spoke. Leave the bread, he said. Isabella let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She placed the tray on the hall table. The Earl walked away. But his footsteps sounded different. Less like a march. More like a man walking on uncertain ground. Over the next few days, the ice at Ravenscroft didn't shatter. It melted. Drop by drop. The change was subtle. It started with the noise. Alistair didn't banish the laughter, echoing from the nursery anymore. He would sit in his study. The door cracked open an inch. Listening to Isabella, reading stories in dramatic voices. Doing terrible impressions of dragons and knights. Then, he started joining them. It was a Tuesday when Isabella found him in the garden. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the earth rich and damp. She was showing Leo how to find frogs near the pond. Alistair approached, stiff in his riding gear. He watched them for a moment. That section of the fence is loose, he observed, pointing to the paddock rail. Then perhaps we should fix it, Isabella said, not looking up from the mud. Before the ponies escape, I have men for that, Alistair said. And yet, Isabella said, wiping mud from her cheek. Hands are useful things. My lord. They remember how to work. 10 minutes later. The Earl of Ravenscroft had removed his coat. He was holding a hammer. Julian was holding the nails. They weren't talking, the silence was still there, but it was a companionable silence. A working silence. Isabella watched from the terrace. She saw Alistair guide Julian's hand on the hammer, correcting his grip. She saw the way Alistair's eyes lingered on the boy's head. A look of painful, terrifying love. Later that evening, the house was filled with music. Isabella sat at the grand piano in the drawing room. She played Chopin melancholy, but hopeful. Alistair stood by the fireplace, a glass of brandy in his hand. He wasn't looking at the fire. He was looking at her. He watched the way the firelight caught the curve of her neck. He watched her hands moving over the keys. The same hands that had covered his kitchen in flour. The same hands that had bandaged his son's toy. She looked up. Their eyes met across the room. The air between them pulled tight, like a violin string. It wasn't just gratitude he felt. It was a gravitational pull. He wanted to cross the room. He wanted to stand behind her. To smell the rosemary that seemed to cling to her skin now. He saw her smile at him, a small, private thing, and terror flooded his veins, because Alistair Thorne knew that feeling. He remembered how it felt to love something this much. And he remembered exactly how it felt when the world took it away. Isabella stopped playing. The piano is out of tune. She whispered into the quiet. Everything in this house is out of tune, Alistair said, his voice rough. He set his glass down. The sound sharp against the wood. Good night, Isabella. He walked out of the room quickly. As if he were being chased, Isabella remained at the keys, her hands hovering over the silence he left behind. She knew he was running. But for the first time, she suspected he wasn't running because he didn't care. He was running because he was starting to, and that, she knew, was a much more dangerous storm to navigate. Saturday arrived wrapped in silk and deception. It was the night of the midsummer ball, the climax of the social season, and Ravenscroft Manor had been transformed. The great stone hall, usually so imposing, was now a cavern of light. Chandeliers dripped with crystals that scattered rainbows across the floor, and the scent of hothouse roses was heavy enough to drown out the lingering smell of beeswax and old rain. Lord Alistair Thorne stood at the edge of the ballroom. He was wearing formal evening dress, the star of an order pinned to his chest. He looked devastatingly handsome, but he also looked like a man standing on a cliff edge, trying to decide whether to step back or jump. In his pocket, his fingers brushed against a small velvet box, a ring, an heirloom. He had spent the last 3 days rehearsing speeches in front of his mirror. Speeches that spoke of second chances and sunrises. He was ready. He was finally ready to let the light in. And then, Isabella appeared at the top of the grand staircase. The room, filled with the county's elite, in their pale pinks, powder blues, and soft creams, seemed to inhale collectively. Isabella was not wearing pastel. She was wearing crimson, deep, shimmering, blood-red silk that hugged her frame and flared at the waist. In a sea of English watercolors, she was a stroke of vibrant oil paint. She descended the stairs, her head high. She looked like a queen. She looked like a woman who had conquered the castle. Alistair walked to the bottom of the stairs to meet her. He didn't bow immediately. He just stared, struck dumb by the reality of her. "You are wearing red," he said, his voice low, intimate amidst the crowd. "It is my color." "Alistair," she replied, a small, nervous smile playing on her lips. "In Rome, red is for celebration. Is it too much?" Alistair offered his arm. "It is exactly enough. For an hour." Everything was perfect. It was the kind of perfection that makes you hold your breath, because you know it cannot last. They danced. Alistair, the man who supposedly hated noise and crowds, spun her across the floor. He held her closer than was strictly proper. He looked at her, not as a host looks at a guest, but as a starving man looks at a feast. But happiness in a story like this is fragile. It is glass, waiting to be shattered. And the hammer arrived in the form of a man standing by the champagne tower. He was blonde, golden-skinned, and wearing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Viscount Stirling, the man who had courted Isabella in Rome, promised her the world, and then publicly abandoned her for a woman with a larger dowry. He was the reason she had fled to England. He was the reason she was here, rebuilding her life from scraps. Alistair didn't see him at first. He had stepped away to speak to the orchestra conductor, to request a specific waltz for the proposal. Isabella saw him instantly. The color drained from her face, leaving her pale against the crimson dress. She tried to turn, to flee toward the terrace. But Stirling was a hunter. He moved with the slick, easy confidence of a man who owned every room he entered. "Isabella." His voice slid over her like oil. A bold color. "But then, you always did crave attention." She froze. She turned to face him near the heavy velvet curtains of the balcony alcove. "You were not invited." "Stirling, I am a guest of Lord Markham." Stirling grinned, sipping his champagne. "He insisted I come. He said there was an Italian curiosity staying at Ravenscroft. I had to see for myself." "Leave," Isabella hissed. "Now, or what?" Stirling stepped closer. He invaded her space. He reached out and touched the emerald necklace at her throat, a loan from the Thorne family vault. It was a possessive, familiar gesture that made Isabella's skin crawl. "You think you're playing the lady of the manor, don't you?" Stirling whispered, leaning down, so his breath hit her ear. "But look around. Bella, look at them. They are laughing at you." The Italian, in the red dress, playing mother to another man's children. "I am not playing," Isabella said, her voice shaking with a rage so hot it felt like lava. "Of course you are." Stirling chuckled darkly. "And this Duke Thorne, he doesn't love you. He needs a nanny. He needs a warm body to keep his bed damp and his children quiet. You are a utility to him, darling, just as you were to me. You will never be English enough, quiet enough, or cold enough for this life." Isabella was trembling. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides, shaking with the effort not to strike him across the face, in the middle of the ballroom. Across the room, Alistair turned back. He saw them. He didn't hear the words. He couldn't hear the venom Stirling was spitting. He only saw the tableau. He saw a handsome, golden-haired man, standing close to Isabella. Too close. He saw the man's hand resting familiarly on her necklace. He saw the way the man leaned in. Intimate and exclusive. and he saw Isabella shaking. Alistair stopped. The music seemed to warp and slow down. The tunnel vision of trauma snapped into place. To Alistair, Isabella didn't look angry. She looked overcome. She looked like a woman standing in front of a lover she hadn't forgotten, the voice in Alistair's head, the one he had spent 10 years trying to silence, roared to life. I am the second choice. I am the consolation prize. She is vibrant and alive. And I am just the broken widower with the drafty house. Of course she still loves him. Look at them. He watched as Isabella stepped back, looking flushed. He watched Sterling laugh. Alistair didn't storm over. He didn't challenge Sterling to a duel. That would have required passion. And Alistair had just decided. In that split second, that passion was a mistake. He shut down. The walls of Ravenscroft, which Isabella had spent weeks dismantling brick by brick, slammed back into place in an instant. The frost returned. He turned and walked toward the library. Isabella, having finally dismissed Sterling with a threat to call the footmen, turned to find Alistair. She needed him. She needed his solid presence to ground her after the assault of her past. She saw him leaving the ballroom. Alistair, she called, picking up her skirts and running after him. She caught him in the library. The fire was out. He was standing by the desk, his back to her, pouring a brandy. The air in the room felt 20 degrees colder than the hallway. Alistair, Isabella breathed, closing the door. That man. He is. I know who he is, Alistair said. He didn't turn around. His voice was unrecognizable. It was the voice of the man she had met on the first day flat. Devoid of emotion. Bureaucratic. Viscount Sterling. Your intended, my ex-intended, Isabella corrected, walking toward him. He is a snake. He came here to mock me. He came here, Alistair said, taking a sip of the amber liquid. And you stood with him. You let him touch you. You were trembling. Isabella, I was trembling with rage. Were you? Alistair finally turned. His face was a mask of marble. The warmth was gone. The eyes that had looked at her with adoration an hour ago were now shielded behind thick glass. It looked remarkably like regret. Regret. Isabella stopped. You think I regret leaving a man who treated me like an accessory? I think, Alistair said coolly, setting the glass down, that we have let this charade go on too long. The month is nearly up. The experiment has run its course. Isabella felt like she had been slapped. The experiment. Is that what this is? The baking, the piano, the children. The children require a governess, Alistair said, looking past her. At the wall. I will hire a professional. Someone suitable. Someone who understands boundaries. I see, Isabella whispered. The hurt crashed over her. But she refused to drown in it. She realized what he was doing. She saw the fear behind the ice. He was hurting her before she could hurt him. He was rejecting her so she couldn't reject him. It was cowardly. And it broke her heart. You are dismissing me, she stated. I am releasing you, Alistair corrected. You are free to go back to Italy. Or to London. Or to him. It matters little to me. He was lying. It mattered more than anything in the world. But he would rather die alone in this cold house than ask her to stay, and hear her say she wanted someone else. Isabella drew herself up. The crimson silk rustled. She wasn't the girl who had cried in Rome. She was the woman who had tamed the monsters of Ravenscroft. You are a fool, Alistair, she said, her voice quiet and deadly. He flinched. Just barely. You saw a ghost tonight, she continued, stepping closer, forcing him to look at her. You didn't see me. You saw your own fear. You decided I was leaving before I had even packed a bag. I am simply being practical. Alistair muttered. No, Isabella said. You are being safe. And safety is cold. Alistair, It is lonely. She reached out and placed her hand on the desk, right next to his clenched fist. She didn't touch him. She wouldn't give him that comfort. I fixed your son's horse, she said, her voice trembling now, with sadness, not rage. I fixed the silence in your hall. I fixed the fear in your daughter's eyes. I fixed your children's toys. Alistair, she paused, waiting for him to break, waiting for him to reach out. He didn't move. He stared at the brandy. But, Isabella finished softly, pulling her hand back. I cannot fix a man who prefers to be broken. She waited one more second. A heartbeat. 2. Silence. Goodbye. My lord, she whispered. Isabella turned and walked out of the library. She walked through the ballroom, past the staring guests, past the smirking Viscount Stirling. She didn't run. She walked with her head high, the red dress trailing behind her, like the sunset of a day that would never come again. And in the library, in the dark, Alistair Thorne stood alone. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the velvet box. He opened it. The diamond glittered in the gloom, cold and hard and perfect. He snapped the box shut and threw it into the fireplace. Sunday morning broke over Ravenscroft Manor, not with sunlight, but with a heavy, muted gray. The decorations from the ball had been stripped away, leaving the great hall looking more barren than it ever had before. The magic of the previous night, the crimson dress, the music, the almost proposal had evaporated, leaving behind the cold, a hard reality of a packed trunk in the blue suite. Isabella Rossi was folding the red silk dress. She placed it into the leather interior of her luggage, smoothing it down with a hand that trembled. Just slightly. She wasn't crying. She had done her crying hours ago. Now, she was simply moving through the motions of leaving, fueled by the terrifying efficiency of a woman who knows she has overstayed her welcome. She clicked the latch of the trunk shut. It made a hollow, final sound, but when she opened the door to the hallway, she found her path blocked. They were a barricade of heartbreak. Julian was sitting directly on top of her second travel chest, his arms crossed, his legs dangling, staring at the floor. Clara was sitting on the rug, clutching Barnaby the dog so tightly, the poor terrier looked ready to pop. And Leo was nowhere to be seen. Julian, Isabella said softly, you have to get off the trunk. The footmen need to take it downstairs. No, Julian said. He didn't look up. His voice was thick. If I don't get off, they can't take it. If they can't take it, you can't leave. I have to leave. Julian, the month is over. You said you weren't a guest. Clara sobbed into the dog's fur. You said guests leave. But family stays, Clara. Isabella knelt down, her heart fracturing in her chest. Sometimes, adults make mistakes. Sometimes, plans change. He made you leave, Julian said, looking up. His eyes were red-rimmed. Father, he ruins everything. He wants it to be quiet again. Do not say that, Isabella said firmly, reaching out to touch his knee. Your father is a good man. Julian. He is just protecting himself from what Julian demanded. From being happy, Isabella didn't have an answer for that. She felt a tug on her skirt. She looked down. Leo had emerged from behind the doorframe. He was holding the wooden horse she had bandaged weeks ago. Take me, Leo whispered. It wasn't a question. It was a demand. I can't take you. Leo, this is your home. Alistair is your father. He doesn't know how to fix the horses, Leo said, his voice wobbling. And he doesn't know about the thunder. Isabella felt a tear finally escape, tracking hot down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly. She couldn't break down now. If she crumbled, they would never let her go. He will learn, Isabella promised, though she wasn't sure if she believed it. I will leave him a list. I will tell him everything. She stood up. She gently guided Julian off the trunk. The sound of the heavy luggage being dragged across the floor by the footman was awful. A scraping, grinding noise that sounded like the house itself was groaning in protest. She walked to the small writing desk in the hall. She took a piece of parchment. She didn't write, "Dear Alistair." She didn't write, "I love you." Those words were too heavy for a goodbye. She wrote only 2 sentences. "The storm is only scary if you face it alone. Don't make them face it alone." She folded the paper. She handed it to Mr. Higgins, who was standing by the stairs, looking older than she had ever seen him. "Give this to him," she whispered. "When I am gone." She walked down the stairs, out the heavy oak doors, and into the waiting carriage. She didn't look back. She couldn't. 3 floors down, in the darkened study, Lord Alistair Thorne was staring at a glass of brandy. It was 11 in the morning. The house was silent. The silence he had craved for 3 years. The silence he had demanded. And now that he had it, it felt less like peace and more like a vacuum, sucking the air out of his lungs. The door creaked open. "Get out," Alistair said, without turning. "I'm afraid I cannot do that." "My lord." Alistair turned. Higgins walked into the room. He wasn't carrying a tray. He wasn't carrying the mail. He was carrying a small, folded piece of paper. "I did not ring for you." Higgins. "No. Sir. You rarely ring when you need help. A habit you acquired after the late Countess passed." Alistair stiffened. Higgins had served this family for 30 years. He was the only man alive who had seen Alistair cry. "I do not need help," Alistair said, his voice ice cold. "I need you to leave me to my drink. Then you shall have to fire me." "Sir," Higgins said evenly. He placed the note on the desk. "Because I cannot remain silent while you make a mistake that will haunt this house for another 10 years. Alistair stared at the butler. "Careful." "Higgins, she is gone." "Sir," Higgins said. "The carriage left 10 minutes ago. Let her go." Alistair muttered, gripping his glass. "She belongs with him. You saw them last night. The familiarity, the passion. I am merely the safe harbor. She deserves the ocean." "I saw a lady who was terrified," Higgins corrected. "Terrified that you would not step in. Terrified that the man she learned to love was going to let her walk away because of his own pride." "Pride?" Alistair slammed the glass down. "I am trying to spare her. I am a broken man." "Higgins, you are a man." Higgins snapped a tone he had never used. "And in 30 years, I have never seen the sun shine in this house until she walked through that door. You say you are protecting her. No. You are protecting yourself." Higgins walked to the door. He paused, his hand on the brass handle. "If you let that carriage reach the train station..." "Sir, you are not a fool. You are a coward." The door clicked shut. Alistair stood in the silence. The word hung in the air. Coward. He looked at the note on the desk. He unfolded it. "The storm is only scary if you face it alone." He closed his eyes. He thought of Julian's laughter in the kitchen. He thought of the focaccia. He thought of Isabella in the crimson dress, standing against the world, waiting for him to stand beside her, and he had walked away. Alistair Thorne let out a roar of frustration that shook the walls. He didn't ring for a servant. He didn't call for the carriage. He ran. He sprinted through the great hall, past the startled maids, out the side door, and across the gravel toward the stables. The stable master was bringing out a horse Obsidian, a massive black stallion that only Alistair could ride. "Saddle him," Alistair shouted, tearing off his cravat. "Sir," the mud. He didn't wait for a mounting block. He swung onto the horse, his formal trousers straining, his boots sliding in the stirrups. He kicked the horse into a gallop. He didn't take the road. The road was slow. He turned Obsidian toward the woods, cutting a dangerous path through the trees and the drying mud. Branches whipped at his face. Mud splattered his coat. He didn't care. He rode like a man possessed. He rode like a father. He rode like a man in love. The carriage was slow, navigating the deep ruts of the country lane. Inside, Isabella stared at her hands. They were empty. Suddenly, the carriage lurched. The driver shouted. The horses whinnied in panic. Halt! Stop the carriage. Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew that voice. She threw open the door before the wheels had even stopped turning. There, blocking the road, was a black horse, its sides heaving, and sliding off its back was Alistair. He looked wild. There was mud on his cheek. His hair was windblown. He looked nothing like the composed, icy Earl she had met weeks ago. He looked undone. He marched to the carriage door. He was breathless. He gasped, gripping the doorframe. You leave very quickly. I have a train to catch. Isabella said, her voice trembling, trying to hold on to her dignity. Why are you here? Alistair, did I steal the silver, or did I forget to sign the exit papers? You forgot to say goodbye, he said, climbing into the carriage uninvited. I left a note. A note. He pulled the crumpled paper from his pocket. This isn't a goodbye. Isabella. This is an accusation. It is the truth, she cried. You let me go. You saw me standing there with Sterling. Humiliated. And you walked away. I walked away because I thought you wanted him. Alistair shouted back. The confession exploded in the small space. Isabella blinked. What? I saw him touch you. Alistair said, his voice dropping to a raw, painful whisper. I saw the history between you. I saw you shaking. And I thought, I am the second choice. I thought I was just the safe. A boring English widower you were settling for, until something better came along. You thought I wanted Sterling. Isabella let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. The man who treated me like a doll. The man who broke me. She leaned forward, grabbing Alistair's lapels. I was shaking. Alistair. Because I was angry. And because I was waiting for you. I was waiting for the man I respected to step in. I was afraid. Alistair admitted, looking down at his muddy boots. My wife, she didn't love me. Isabella. It was an arrangement. When she died, I promised myself I would never again force affection from a woman who didn't feel it. I couldn't bear to be the one you settled for. Isabella softened. She saw the wound now. It wasn't arrogance. It was a scar. Deep and old. She reached out and took his face in her hands. His skin was cold from the wind, but his eyes were burning. I don't settle. Alistair. She whispered fiercely. I am Italian. We do not do things halfway. I choose. And I chose the man who eats burnt focaccia to make his son smile. I chose the man who fixes fences in the mud. I chose you. Alistair looked at her. The fear in his eyes began to recede, replaced by a desperate hope. I am a difficult man, he warned. I am moody. I have 3 children who are terrified of thunder. I come with a very large, very drafty house. I like the house. Isabella smiled, tears finally spilling over. And I love the children. I even like the dog. Come back. Alistair whispered. He leaned his forehead against hers. Not for them. For me. Come back. Because the silence is unbearable without you. You ruined my exit. She laughed through her tears. It was very dramatic. I will ruin all your exits. Alistair promised. I intend to be the only door you ever walk through. He kissed her then. It wasn't polite. It wasn't an English peck. It was desperate. Messy. And full of promises. It tasted of rain and relief. Let's go home. He whispered against her lips. Yes, Isabella said. Let's go home. 1 year later, the sun didn't just shine on Ravenscroft Manor. It seemed to live there. The windows of the great hall were thrown wide open, letting the summer breeze drift through the stone corridors. But the breeze wasn't the only thing moving through the house. Music, a lively, upbeat piano concerto poured out of the drawing room. On the terrace, chaos reigned. Julian was no longer the angry miniature landlord. He was running across the lawn, chasing a cricket ball, laughing as he dove into the grass. Clara was sitting under the old oak tree, reading a book aloud to a captivated audience of 3 stuffed bears, and Leo was standing on a chair, explaining loudly to Barnaby the dog exactly how the cloud formation above looked like a giant pastry. It's a croissant. Barnaby, look. Sitting on the stone bench, watching it all, were Alistair and Isabella. Alistair wasn't wearing a coat. His sleeves were rolled up. He looked relaxed, younger. The lines of grief around his eyes smoothed away by a year of noise. He squeezed Isabella's hand. It is very loud, he noted, though there was no complaint in his voice. It is, Isabella agreed, resting her head on his shoulder. Are you suffering, my lord? Terribly. Alistair smiled, bringing her hand to his lips. I haven't had a moment of silence in 12 months. Good, Isabella whispered. Alistair looked at his wife, then at his children playing in the golden light. He realized that Higgins was right. The winter had been long, and the dark had been deep, but the storm had passed, and so, the winter at Ravenscroft finally ended. Not with a whisper, but with the sound of laughter, a barking dog, and a love that was worth the storm. If this story warmed your heart, please leave a like and share it with someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late for a second chance. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a story. Thank you for watching.